6 months ago, my neighbor demanded I tear down an eyesore. She didn't know that eyesore kept our entire street connected. The HOA board voted unanimously against me without warning. Neighbors online mocked photos of my rusty tin monster. I stayed calm and said nothing, just filed one email. A single phone call to the right office changed everything. Karen's perfect smile started slipping when the county called back. What happened next left the whole cul-de-sac speechless. My name is Mark Delaney, 44, a widowed father raising 2 teenagers in Ridgeview Meadows, Ohio. I inherited my grandfather's 40-acre farm before developers carved subdivisions around it. I kept the land, the old barn, and one weathered grain silo standing quietly at the property's edge, half hidden behind maple trees. Life was steady: soccer practices, mortgage payments, Sunday pancakes. I worked remotely as a network engineer, which meant reliable internet wasn't a luxury for me. It was survival. I never imagined that silo, dismissed by neighbors as ugly clutter, would become the center of the biggest fight of my life. Ridgeview Meadows had only existed 12 years, built on land subdivided from farms like mine. When my grandfather sold half his acreage to developers, he kept one condition: our 5 remaining acres, silo included, stayed exempt from strict HOA architectural rules. Nobody remembered that clause anymore, nobody except me. Karen Whitlock moved into the neighborhood 8 years ago, campaigned hard, and became HOA president 3 years running. She measured mailbox heights, fined faded shutters, and mailed color-coded warning letters for grass exceeding 4 inches. Neighbors joked she'd once measured a birdhouse's paint sheen. Nobody laughed to her face. I mostly avoided HOA meetings. My property technically sat inside the association's mapped boundary but outside its enforcement authority, thanks to my grandfather's grandfathered agreement. I paid dues out of neighborliness, not obligation. That distinction mattered more than I realized, and Karen had never bothered to check it. The silo itself looked ordinary: corrugated steel, rust streaks, a faded weather vane on top. What no one saw was the equipment inside: routing cabinets, backup batteries, and a discrete antenna array disguised beneath a false cupola. Years earlier, I'd leased it quietly to Signal Peak Wireless to boost rural coverage. Signal Peak's engineers had explained it plainly: terrain and tree cover blocked traditional towers from reaching Ridgeview Meadows efficiently. My silo's height and location made it the ideal discrete solution. No flashing lights, no chain link fence, just a repurposed farm structure quietly carrying cell signal for the entire subdivision. The lease came with a confidentiality clause, standard for camouflage towers, meant to deter tampering or vandalism. I never advertised it. Most neighbors assumed the silo was simply decorative farm nostalgia I refused to demolish. Karen assumed the same, and decided nostalgia wasn't good enough for her curb appeal standards. It started small: a comment at a block party about that eyesore ruining property values. Then a photo of my silo appeared in the HOA newsletter's community concerns section, captioned "Unsightly structures, time for action?" I laughed it off. I had no idea she meant it as a declaration of war. My daughter Ellie, 16, texted me a screenshot from the neighborhood Facebook group. Someone had posted side-by-side photos, manicured lawns beside my rustic monstrosity. Comments piled up fast, mostly strangers repeating Karen's talking points. I told Ellie not to worry. People forget outrage within a week. I was wrong. Karen requested a formal architectural review, technically outside her jurisdiction over my parcel, but she filed it anyway through the county planning office, framing it as a community safety hazard. I received a certified letter citing structural concerns nobody had ever raised before, signed personally by HOA President Karen Whitlock. I called the county office to clarify. The clerk, apologetic, explained Karen had submitted photos claiming rust damage posed collapse risk to nearby homes. No inspector had actually visited my property. It was, functionally, an unverified complaint dressed up as an emergency safety filing, clever, aggressive, and completely baseless. I requested a private meeting with Karen instead of escalating publicly. She agreed, greeting me with a tight smile and a folder labeled Whitlock vs. Silo documentation. She'd printed color photographs, marked with red circles around rust spots, alongside printed HOA bylaws highlighted in yellow. She meant business. It's an eyesore, Mark, she said, sliding the folder across her granite kitchen island. Our community standards matter. Home values matter. I explained the grandfather clause exempting my property. She waved it off. Clauses can be revisited, she said, smiling like she'd already won. I mentioned, carefully, that the silo served an important function beyond appearance. Karen cut me off. Appearances. She wasn't interested in specifics. To her, function sounded like an excuse invented on the spot by a stubborn neighbor unwilling to modernize his crumbling farm relic. Over the following weeks, HOA newsletters mentioned the silo 3 more times, each time framed slightly more urgently: structural hazard, fire risk, attracting pests. None were substantiated. I started keeping a folder of my own, screenshots, letters, timestamps. Something told me I'd need documentation before this was over. My neighbor Ruth, 78, widowed, stopped me at the mailbox one afternoon. Karen's telling everyone you're endangering the neighborhood, she whispered. Half the ladies at Bunko believe her. Ruth patted my arm. I don't. Been standing longer than half these houses. Her support meant more than she knew. I learned later that Karen had quietly proposed an HOA-funded structural demolition fund, citing unavoidable safety liability, despite having zero engineering assessment. Board members, intimidated by her tenure and temper, rubber-stamped the proposal in a closed session. Nobody thought to ask why she was pushing so aggressively. A subtle detail bothered me. Karen's son, Tyler, worked in telecom sales. I'd seen his job title once on a community fundraiser flyer. I didn't think much of it then. It seemed irrelevant. A coincidence buried under her relentless obsession with lawn heights and mailbox paint colors. I filed it away anyway. The HOA sent me an official notice. Remove or remediate non-conforming structure within 30 days. Or incur daily fines of $250. 30 days. I read the letter twice, disbelieving. My grandfather's exemption clause, apparently, had been quietly amended in a board vote I was never notified to attend. I called the county recorder's office to verify the amendment's legality. The clerk found no filed documentation supporting a legitimate amendment vote, only meeting minutes referencing unanimous verbal consent, and signed, unwitnessed. It looked less like proper governance and more like something written after the fact to justify a decision already made. I decided not to panic publicly. Instead, I contacted Signal Peak Wireless directly, informing them of the HOA's demolition threat. Their regional manager, Diane Farrow, went quiet on the phone for a long moment before saying, "Mark, do you have any idea what removing that tower would actually do to that neighborhood?" Diane explained that Signal Peak's coverage maps showed my silo as the sole load-bearing node serving Ridgeview Meadow cell traffic, including 911 dispatch relay, medical alert systems, and home security monitoring. Without it, calls would drop, alarms would fail silently, and emergency response times could stretch dangerously long. I finally understood the stakes. I attended the next HOA meeting, armed with Diane's explanation, hoping calm facts would defuse tension. Karen ran the meeting like a courtroom, banging her gavel-shaped stress ball for order. When I raised my hand to speak, she glanced at the clock and said, "Public comment is limited to 2 minutes." I explained, carefully avoiding specifics due to Signal Peak's confidentiality clause, that the silo served critical communications infrastructure for the neighborhood. Karen smirked. She repeated to the room, drawing laughter. "It's a barn decoration, Mark. Let's not dress up nostalgia as national security." The room laughed along. I couldn't legally disclose full lease details without violating my contract, which made my explanation sound evasive, even paranoid. Karen capitalized instantly. "If it's really that important, why can't you just tell us what it does?" she asked sweetly, knowing I was cornered by my own confidentiality obligations. The vote proceeded anyway, 30 days to demolish or begin daily fines. 6 board members raised hands in favor. 1 abstained, visibly uncomfortable. I watched neighbors nod along, trusting Karen's confident tone over my hesitant, legally restricted answers. Walking out, I felt smaller than I had in years. That night, Ellie found me at the kitchen table staring at the fine schedule. "Dad, why didn't you just tell them what it really is?" she asked. I explained the confidentiality clause. She frowned. "Who knows how bad this could get? And nobody believes you." The following week, Karen posted a victory update on the community Facebook page. Photos of my silo captioned, "Progress." HOA board votes to restore neighborhood standards. Comments flooded in thumbs-up emojis. Finally, about time. A few neighbors tagged me directly, asking when demolition would begin. I didn't respond. Tyler, Karen's son, commented publicly too. "Proud of Mom for standing up to selfish holdouts blocking progress." I noticed something odd. His comment mentioned upgraded infrastructure coming soon. A strange phrase for someone supposedly uninvolved. I screenshotted it, unsure yet what it meant, but my instincts sharpened. Diane from Signal Peak called again, worried. "If demolition proceeds, we're required to notify the FCC and county emergency services about a functioning tower removal," she said. "That triggers reviews Karen clearly isn't expecting." I asked her to hold off contacting anyone yet. I wanted to try resolving this quietly first. I requested another private meeting with Karen, bringing printed HOA bylaws highlighting procedural violations in the amendment vote. She barely glanced at them. "I don't have time to relitigate paperwork, Mark." The board voted. "Or the fines start Friday." It's simple. Thinned. I asked directly, "Why does this matter so much to you, Karen?" She hesitated half a second, a flicker I almost missed, before recovering her composure. "Because standards matter," she said flatly. That half-second hesitation stayed with me longer than anything else she said that day. Friday arrived. $250 daily, deposited automatically from my HOA-linked account per bylaws I'd never carefully read before now. I calculated 30 days meant $7,500 before any legal appeal could even reach a hearing date. Karen had built a financial pressure clock designed to force quick surrender. Ruth stopped by with a casserole. Unprompted. "Karen fined me once for a garden gnome," she said, shaking her head. "Cost me $200 over a 2-inch ceramic elf. She doesn't back down. Mark. Ever." I thanked her for the food. And for the warning. Equally, I filed a formal appeal with the HOA's grievance committee, citing the improperly documented bylaw amendment. Karen, as board president, controlled the grievance committee's scheduling. My hearing date was set 45 days out, conveniently 15 days after the demolition deadline would already have passed under the fine schedule. Meanwhile, Diane at Signal Peak flagged something unusual in their system. An unsolicited third-party inquiry requesting technical specifications about potential replacement infrastructure for Ridgeview Meadows, submitted through a competing telecom company. The inquiry listed a contact name that made her pause before reading it aloud to me over the phone. "The contact name is Tyler Whitlock," Diane said. My stomach dropped, cheering her fight online. He worked for HarborLink Telecom, a Signal Peak competitor actively pitching a new visible tower contract to the county, contingent on Signal Peak's coverage gap becoming publicly obvious first. Suddenly Karen's relentless campaign made a different kind of sense. If my silo came down, Ridgeview Meadows would suffer service outages severe enough to justify an emergency infrastructure upgrade, conveniently pitched by her son's company, likely with Karen quietly benefiting from referral bonuses or family financial incentive structures. I had no proof yet, only a name and a hunch. I decided to stay quiet a little longer, gathering evidence instead of accusations. Confronting Karen prematurely, without documentation, would only let her spin another counter-narrative to the neighborhood before I could establish anything concrete enough to matter. I asked Diane to send me, in writing, everything permissible under the lease regarding coverage dependency and the anonymous inquiry from HarborLink. She agreed, cautiously, understanding the stakes now extended beyond one silo, toward whether an entire neighborhood's emergency communications could be manipulated for private profit. At school pickup, another parent, Janice, mentioned her elderly mother's medical alert pendant had glitched twice recently, failing to connect during test calls. "Probably just old technology," she shrugged. I said nothing, but privately noted it. Another quiet data point suggesting how fragile our coverage truly was. That weekend, a summer storm rolled through, knocking out power lines 2 streets over. My phone still showed full signal bars. Neighbors' group chats lit up complaining about spotty service and delayed text messages. Nobody connected the dots yet, but the silo was quietly proving its worth in real time. Karen, unaware of the storm's small revelation, posted another cheerful update. "Demolition deadline approaching. Let's restore Ridgeview's beauty together." Comments cheered her on. I closed my laptop, took a breath, and realized the tension wasn't fading. It was building toward something neither of us could fully control yet. Monday morning, a legal notice arrived. The HOA had filed a lien against my property for accumulated fines, now exceeding $2,000. My bank flagged the automatic withdrawals as suspicious activity, freezing my account temporarily. I spent an hour on hold just explaining I wasn't a fraud victim. Ellie came home upset, saying kids at school had seen the Facebook posts and were calling our house the junkyard place. My younger son, Noah, 12, asked quietly if we were going to get kicked out of the neighborhood. I promised him we weren't, though privately I wasn't entirely sure. I hired a local attorney, Rosa Delgado, who specialized in HOA disputes. She reviewed the amendment paperwork and whistled low. "This wouldn't survive 5 minutes in front of a judge," she said. "No proper notice, no quorum documentation, no recorded vote count. This is procedurally rotten from top to bottom." Rosa drafted a cease and desist letter demanding the HOA suspend fines pending a legitimate review of the amendment's validity. Karen responded within hours, not to Rosa, but with a mass email to the entire neighborhood. Some residents are hiring lawyers instead of simply following community rules. Disappointing, but not surprising. The email worked exactly as she intended. Neighbors who'd been neutral suddenly viewed me as combative, litigious, difficult. A dad from soccer practice avoided eye contact at pickup. Someone left a printed HOA bylaw pamphlet taped to my mailbox, underlined aggressively in red ink. The pressure campaign was working. I asked Rosa whether we could disclose the tower's existence to defend ourselves publicly. She warned that breaching Signal Peak's confidentiality clause could expose me to separate contractual liability, potentially worse than the HOA dispute itself. I was legally boxed in, forced to fight blind while Karen fought with full information. Diane offered a solution. Signal Peak's legal team could send the HOA a formal notice themselves, without requiring me to breach confidentiality personally. It would take time to draft properly, she warned, given the sensitivity around disclosing exact tower locations for security reasons. Time, unfortunately, was the one thing I lacked. Meanwhile, HarborLink Telecom quietly submitted a formal proposal to the County Planning Commission for a new, community-approved communications tower, citing documented coverage gaps expected in Ridgeview Meadows. The timing, filed just days after my HOA notice, felt far too convenient to be coincidental anymore. I compiled everything into a timeline: Karen's newsletter campaign, the improperly documented amendment, Tyler's HarborLink employment, the suspicious proposal filing. Individually, each piece looked circumstantial. Together, they sketched something uglier, a coordinated effort disguised as neighborhood beautification, benefiting one family financially at everyone else's communication expense. At the next HOA meeting, Karen introduced a new agenda item: emergency funding for neighborhood infrastructure modernization, vaguely worded, requesting a one-time special assessment of $400 per household. She didn't mention HarborLink by name. Board members, trusting her leadership, seemed ready to approve it without deeper questions. I raised my hand again, asking directly what modernization meant and which company would provide it. Karen deflected smoothly. Details are still being finalized. Mark, I think you, of all people, would support improved neighborhood infrastructure. The irony wasn't lost on me, though the room missed it entirely. After the meeting, an older board member, Frank Cassidy, pulled me aside quietly. "Something's felt off about this whole push," he admitted. "Karen's usually stubborn. Sure, but this feels rushed, almost desperate." like she's on a deadline nobody else knows about. I thanked him, filing away another ally. Rosa suggested requesting official HOA financial records through a formal disclosure request. Standard procedure available to any dues-paying member. Karen, as president, was legally obligated to comply within 15 business days. I submitted the request, half expecting stonewalling, half hoping for the paper trail we desperately needed. 15 days passed with no response. Rosa sent a formal follow-up citing state HOA transparency statutes, warning of potential legal consequences for continued non-compliance. 2 days later, a heavily redacted folder finally arrived, dates blacked out, vendor names obscured, but one unredacted line slipped through, consulting fee T. Whitlock. I stared at that line for a long time. A consulting fee, paid from HOA reserve funds, to Karen's own son, for reasons the redacted document conveniently failed to specify. It wasn't proof of everything yet, but it was undeniable proof that something inappropriate was happening behind the community's back. Rosa flagged the payment as a potential conflict of interest violation under state HOA governance law, requiring board disclosure and recusal for related party transactions. Karen had authorized payment to her own son without disclosing the relationship to fellow board members, an omission serious enough to jeopardize her entire presidency if proven. I didn't leak this immediately. Rosa advised patience. Building an airtight case mattered more than a satisfying public reveal. I agreed, though every fiber of me wanted to post that redacted line where the whole neighborhood could see it. Instead, I kept documenting, kept waiting, kept my composure intact. Karen, sensing resistance stiffening, escalated further. She proposed a neighborhood vote authorizing HOA-funded emergency demolition, bypassing the grievance committee entirely by framing it as a public safety emergency requiring immediate community action. It felt less like governance now and more like a coordinated siege. The vote was scheduled for 2 weeks out, timed suspiciously close to Harbor Link's pending county tower approval. If my silo came down before the vote, Harbor Link's coverage gap argument would become undeniable, fast-tracking their contract approval regardless of whether residents fully understood what they were actually voting for. I reached out to Frank Cassidy privately, showing him the redacted consulting fee line. His jaw tightened. He said quietly, "That's a kickback." Full board's financial history more carefully before the emergency vote, promising to raise concerns if patterns emerged. Meanwhile, my daughter Ellie, frustrated by online mockery, started her own quiet research, cross-referencing Harbor Link's public county filings with dates from the HOA newsletter archive. She built a color-coded spreadsheet, proud and determined. "Dad, look," she said one evening. "The timing isn't a coincidence. It's a pattern." Her spreadsheet, surprisingly thorough for a 16-year-old, laid the timeline out visually. Karen's silo complaints, Tyler's Harbor Link inquiry, the consulting payment, Harbor Link's county filing, all within a tight, deliberate sequence. Seeing it mapped out, that clearly hit differently than reading scattered documents separately ever had. Rosa reviewed Ellie's spreadsheet and nodded approvingly. "This is exactly the kind of pattern evidence that persuades a judge, or a room full of skeptical neighbors," she said. We decided the emergency vote meeting would be our moment, not to accuse recklessly, but to present facts, calmly and completely. Diane confirmed Signal Peak's legal notice was finally ready, formally warning the HOA that demolishing an active licensed communication structure without proper federal and county notification could expose the association to significant regulatory penalties, plus liability for any resulting emergency service disruptions. Timing-wise, it would arrive just before the vote. Karen, unaware of the coordinated timeline closing in around her, sent another confident newsletter. Together we restore Ridgeview's beauty. Vote yes on neighborhood progress. Neighbors replied with heart emojis and encouraging comments. I read it twice, feeling something unfamiliar settle over the anxiety I'd carried for weeks now. Quiet resolve. The night before the vote, a summer thunderstorm rolled through again, stronger this time, knocking out power across 3 streets. Cell towers elsewhere in town went dark under storm damage. Ridgeview Meadows, thanks to my silo's backup battery system, stayed fully connected the entire night. Nobody noticed. At 2 a.m., Janice's elderly mother suffered a medical episode. Her alert pendant connected instantly, dispatching paramedics within minutes despite the storm knocking out half the county's cell infrastructure elsewhere. Janice would later credit sheer luck for the fast response, not yet realizing luck had very little to do with it. I learned about the incident the next morning from Ruth, who'd heard it through the neighborhood grapevine before official news even circulated. My stomach tightened with something between vindication and dread. Vindication that the silo mattered exactly as much as I'd claimed. Dread that Karen might still tear it down anyway. I called Diane immediately, asking if Signal Peak could document the storm night's connectivity data specifically, comparing Ridgeview Meadows against neighboring subdivisions that lost service. She confirmed the data existed, clean and undeniable, showing precisely the kind of real-world stakes no newsletter spin could easily dismiss. Rosa suggested presenting this data at the emergency vote meeting alongside Signal Peak's legal notice and the consulting fee evidence, not as an ambush, but as a complete, undeniable picture. Let the facts do the talking, she said. You won't need to raise your voice once, Mark. Just tell the truth. The night before the meeting, I sat with Ellie and Noah at the kitchen table, organizing printed copies, the storm data, the redacted financial document, Ellie's timeline spreadsheet, Signal Peak's formal notice. Noah looked up and asked, "Are we going to win, Dad?" I told him the truth mattered most. We'd see. The morning of the emergency vote arrived unusually calm, sunlight breaking gently through storm-cleared skies. I walked the property line one last time, running my hand along the silo's weathered steel, remembering childhood summers helping my grandfather patch its roof. Felt strange, treating a tin structure like family. Karen, unexpectedly, knocked on my door around noon, alone, without her usual folder of documentation. Can we talk? Just us. Before tonight? She asked. Surprised, I invited her in. For a moment, sitting across my kitchen table, she looked less like a crusading president and more like someone tired. I don't actually hate that silo, she admitted quietly, staring at her coffee mug. I just believe rules matter. Standards matter. Everything falls apart. I almost believed her sincerity, until she added, almost automatically, besides, change is coming either way. Better to control it than resist it. I asked her gently about Tyler's involvement with HarborLink. Her expression flickered, just slightly, before smoothing back into practiced composure. "Tyler's proud of his career," she said carefully. "That has nothing to do with community standards." The deflection was smooth, professional, and just a little too rehearsed to be spontaneous. She left without further explanation, thanking me politely for the coffee, promising the vote tonight would be fair and transparent. Like everything I do. Watching her car pull away, I felt oddly unsettled, not reassured, but aware she suspected I knew more than I'd let on that afternoon. That afternoon, Frank Cassidy called, voice tense. "I pulled 3 years of HOA vendor payments," he said. "There's a pattern, Mark. Small consulting fees, quarterly, always routed through a shell entity called Whitlock Advisory Group. It's not just Tyler. It looks structured, deliberate, ongoing for a while now." Rosa reviewed Frank's findings and confirmed my growing suspicion. This wasn't a single impulsive kickback, but a longer-running financial arrangement, disguised through vague invoicing language across multiple budget cycles. The silo fight, seemed, was simply the latest, most aggressive chapter in a much older pattern of quiet self-dealing. Ellie helped me organize everything into a clean presentation folder for the meeting timeline. Financial records, storm connectivity data, Signal Peak's legal notice. Noah drew a small cartoon silo on the cover page, labeling it the Hero Tower, half joking, half proud. I taped it on anyway. Ruth stopped by that evening, bringing lemon bars for luck, she said. "Whatever happens tonight, Mark, plenty of us know the truth now. Karen doesn't control everyone's mind, no matter how many newsletters she sends." Her quiet confidence steadied something nervous still fluttering in my chest before the meeting. Diane called one final time, confirming Signal Peak's legal notice had been formally delivered to HOA headquarters that afternoon. Time-stamped, certified, undeniable. "Whatever happens tonight," she said. "There's now an official record showing the HOA was warned in writing before any vote regarding an active licensed tower. Small comfort, but real." Rosa reminded me, driving separately to the community center, to stay measured no matter what Karen said publicly. "Judges and neighbors both respond better to calm facts than emotional outbursts," she said. "Let her escalate if she wants. You just lay out the truth, clearly, once, and let it land." I sat in my car outside the community center for a few extra minutes, watching neighbors file inside, chatting casually, unaware of the folder waiting in my passenger seat. Somewhere inside, Karen was likely rehearsing her closing argument for demolition. I took a breath, gathered my papers, and finally stepped out. The community hall buzzed with unusually high attendance. Word of an emergency vote had spread fast. Karen stood at the podium, composed, confident, flipping through note cards. She caught my eye briefly across the room, offering a small, controlled nod, like a chess player confirming her opponent had arrived on schedule. Karen opened the meeting briskly, thanking everyone for showing up to protect Ridgeview's future. She presented renderings of a fictional, beautified courtyard, replacing my silo, complete with landscaped benches and a small fountain, funded partially by the proposed special assessment. Neighbors murmured approvingly at the polished visuals. When public comment opened, I stood, folder in hand, heart steady despite nerves. "Before we vote," I said, I'd like to share some information the board hasn't disclosed publicly yet. Karen's polished smile tightened almost imperceptibly, though she gestured graciously for me to continue, playing composed for the room. I began with the storm data, projecting Signal Peak's connectivity comparison on the shared screen Rosa had arranged beforehand. During last week's storm, 3 neighboring subdivisions lost cell service for hours. Ridgeview Meadows didn't lose a single bar, I explained. That silo isn't decoration. It's a working cell tower. Gasps rippled through the room. Janice, sitting near the front, covered her mouth, realizing suddenly why her mother's medical alert had worked flawlessly that stormy night. Karen interjected quickly, "Interesting claim, but conveniently unverifiable." I nodded calmly and clicked to the next slide, Signal Peak's official certified notice. "This was delivered to HOA headquarters yesterday afternoon," I said, reading the notice aloud, careful to paraphrase rather than display sensitive technical specifics. It confirmed the structure's active license status and warned against unauthorized demolition. Frank Cassidy, seated on the board, leaned forward, visibly absorbing every word. Karen recovered quickly. "Even if true, that doesn't excuse ignoring community aesthetic standards for years," she said smoothly, pivoting the narrative. "We can request relocation, not demolition. Reasonable people compromise." It sounded reasonable, measured, almost gracious, exactly the kind of pivot that could win the room back over. I nodded. It be possible eventually, through proper channels. With Signal Peak's cooperation, I agreed. But that's not what tonight's vote authorizes. Tonight's vote authorizes immediate emergency demolition, funded by a special assessment none of us have seen a real budget breakdown for. The room's energy shifted again. I clicked to the next slide. The redacted financial document. Consulting fee T. Whitlock visible clearly. Silence spread through the hall. Karen's expression cracked for the first time all evening. A flash of genuine alarm quickly masked by forced composure. That's a private personnel matter," she stammered. Frank Cassidy stood unexpectedly, addressing the room directly. "As board treasurer, I reviewed 3 years of vendor payments this week," he said. "There's a recurring pattern of consulting fees paid to an entity called Whitlock Advisory Group. I believe residents deserve full transparency before authorizing any further special assessment tonight." Karen's composure finally slipped visibly. "This is a personal attack, dressed up as governance concern," she snapped, voice sharper than her usual practiced calm. "Tyler has done legitimate consulting work for this board. I don't appreciate insinuations without proper context." Her hands gripped the podium edges a little too tightly. Rosa, seated beside me, spoke up formally as legal counsel present. "State HOA statutes require disclosure and board recusal for related party financial transactions," she said clearly. "If MS payments to her own son without disclosing the relationship, that alone constitutes a serious governance violation, separate from tonight's silo question." A murmur of confusion and anger rippled through the audience. Someone shouted, "Is that true, Karen?" Another neighbor muttered, "That explains the rush." Karen raised her hands defensively. "I can explain everything, but not through public accusations mid-meeting. This is exactly the kind of mob mentality I've worked hard to prevent." Ellie, sitting quietly beside me with her laptop, raised her hand politely. Surprised, Karen called on her, perhaps assuming a teenager posed little threat. Ellie stood, voice steady despite visible nerves. I made a timeline, she said, comparing the silo complaints with Harbor Link's county filings. May I share it? The room fell unusually quiet as a 16-year-old projected her carefully color-coded spreadsheet onto the shared screen. Dates aligned neatly, Karen's newsletter campaigns, Tyler's HarborLink employment start date, the consulting payments, HarborLink's tower proposal filing, a clean, undeniable sequence laid out in simple, easy-to-follow colors and labels. I'm not a lawyer, Ellie said, glancing nervously at Rosa for reassurance. But this doesn't look like a coincidence to me. It looks planned. Scattered applause broke out, uncertain but growing. Karen's face reddened, caught visibly off guard by being challenged so plainly by a teenager in front of the entire neighborhood. This is absurd, Karen said, voice rising. You're letting a child's homework project derail serious community governance? Tyler's employer has nothing to do with HOA business. Frank interjected calmly. Then why did HOA reserve funds pay consulting fees to his personal shell company 3 separate times this year alone? Karen turned to the board, visibly rattled now. I move we table this discussion and proceed directly to the demolition vote as scheduled, she said quickly, trying to regain control of the meeting's momentum. Several board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly reconsidering their earlier confident support for her proposal. The HOA's vice president, a quiet accountant named Bill Ostrander, cleared his throat. I think, given tonight's new information, we should postpone the vote pending a formal financial audit, he said carefully. Voting tonight, under these circumstances, feels premature at best, negligent at worst. Karen's jaw tightened visibly. This is exactly the kind of paralysis that keeps neighborhoods from improving, Karen snapped, losing composure further. I've dedicated years to this community, and now you want to throw everything away over unproven accusations. Her voice cracked slightly, genuine frustration bleeding through her usually flawless public presentation. A neighbor near the back, someone I barely recognized, stood and asked pointedly, Karen, did you know your son worked for a competing telecom company this whole time? The question hung in the air. Karen hesitated, just a beat too long, before answering, I don't see how that's relevant. That non-answer landed harder than any accusation could have. Whispers spread rapidly through the hall. Ruth, sitting near me, muttered under her breath, there it is. I stayed quiet, letting the room process the moment naturally rather than pushing further. Sometimes silence proves a point better than words. Karen attempted one final pivot. Even setting all this aside, she said, straightening her blazer, the silo remains an unauthorized structure violating architectural guidelines. That fact hasn't changed regardless of anything else discussed tonight. Her voice regained some steadiness, clinging to the one argument still technically unrefuted before the room. I stood again, calmly. Actually, it has, I said, presenting Rose's documentation of the amendment's procedural invalidity, no recorded quorum, no signed minutes, no proper notice given to affected residents. My property was never legally subject to those architectural guidelines to begin with. The original exemption was never validly removed. Bill Ostrander reviewed the documentation Rosa handed him, nodding slowly. This amendment doesn't meet our own bylaw's basic procedural requirements, he confirmed aloud. Frankly, I'm not sure this vote should have ever been scheduled in the first place. Karen's carefully constructed case was unraveling faster than she could patch it. The board called for an immediate procedural vote, not on demolition, but on whether tonight's meeting itself had followed proper protocol. The result came back quickly. 5 against proceeding, 1 abstention, Karen alone voting to continue. The demolition vote, for now, was effectively dead before it truly began. Karen stood frozen at the podium for a long moment, the room's energy having completely reversed against her within 30 tense minutes. "This isn't over," she said finally, voice tight. "I'll be requesting an independent review of tonight's proceedings." She gathered her note cards unevenly and left the podium. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors approached me cautiously, some apologetic, some simply curious. Janice hugged me unexpectedly, tears in her eyes. "That silo saved my mother's life during the storm," she said. "I had no idea." Newsletters without asking questions first. I nodded, understanding. Frank Cassidy shook my hand firmly. "I'm calling for a full independent financial audit tomorrow morning," he said. "This goes beyond one silo now. The board owes every resident real transparency, starting immediately." His tone carried the exhausted determination of someone finally done tolerating quiet dysfunction within leadership. Driving home that night, Ellie sat quietly in the passenger seat, still slightly shaking from adrenaline. "Did I do okay?" she asked. I told her she'd done more than okay. She'd helped expose something the adults in the room had been too intimidated to question for years. She smiled, relieved. The next morning, local news picked up the story after an anonymous tip, likely from someone at the meeting. HOA president's family ties to telecom company raise questions. Read the headline. Karen's name appeared prominently, alongside a photo from a previous community event, smiling confidently beside a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Karen released a public statement denying wrongdoing, insisting the consulting payments were standard vendor relationships unrelated to family connections. Few residents believed it anymore. Comment sections that once cheered her silo campaign now filled with pointed questions about years of unquestioned fines, assessments, and quietly approved vendor contracts. HarborLink Telecom, facing sudden unwanted scrutiny, quietly withdrew their county tower proposal within 48 hours, citing unrelated business considerations. Diane called to confirm the news, relief audible in her voice. "Sometimes bad press does what legal notices can't," she said. "Congratulations, Mark. The silo's safe. For now anyway." The HOA's independent audit, launched under Frank's leadership, expanded quickly, uncovering additional questionable vendor relationships beyond just Whitlock. Advisory group, landscaping contracts, security system installations, even a community beautification consultant, who turned out to be Karen's sister-in-law. The pattern, once exposed, revealed itself far wider than anyone expected. Karen requested an emergency board session to address misleading media coverage, but attendance dropped sharply. Only 2 board members showed up, both increasingly distancing themselves publicly from her leadership. The session lasted 11 minutes before adjourning without any formal action. Quiet, anticlimactic collapse of what once felt untouchable. I received an unexpected call from Bill Ostrander, the vice president. Several of us are drafting a formal recall petition, he said. Would you be willing to speak on the record about your experience? For the residents' meeting packet. I agreed, cautiously, unsure yet how far this would actually go. Rosa warned me Karen might escalate personally now that professional avenues were closing around her. People backed into corners sometimes lash out unpredictably, she said. Document everything, keep interactions minimal, and don't engage emotionally if she approaches you directly. I promised to stay careful, though part of me doubted Karen would. 3 days later, my security camera captured Karen's car parked outside my property late at night. Engine running, headlights off. She sat there nearly 20 minutes before driving away without approaching the house. I saved the footage, unsettled by the strange, silent gesture I couldn't quite interpret yet. The following morning, I discovered scratches along the silo's base access panel, the kind consistent with someone attempting to pry it open manually. Nothing appeared stolen or seriously damaged, but the equipment inside remained sensitive. I called Diane immediately, then filed a police report documenting potential attempted tampering. Local police reviewed my security footage, matching Karen's license plate to the vehicle recorded near the silo that night. An officer visited her home for a formal statement. She denied any wrongdoing, claiming she'd simply gone for a drive to clear her head near the neighborhood's edge that evening. Whether or not charges would stick remained uncertain, but the incident report alone proved damaging once local news picked up the story again. HOA president investigated following suspicious activity near disputed property. Public sentiment, already shifting, hardened further against her with each new revelation surfacing that week. The recall petition gathered signatures faster than Bill anticipated. Over 60% of dues-paying households within 10 days, far exceeding the threshold required to force a formal recall vote. Karen's carefully built reputation, cultivated over years of aggressive enforcement and polished newsletters, was unraveling faster than anyone imagined possible. I felt no satisfaction watching it happen, only tired relief. Ellie asked if I felt bad for Karen. I thought carefully before answering. I feel bad it got this far, I told her honestly. But she chose escalation at every single turn, when honesty would have cost her so much less. Karen, cornered publicly and professionally, didn't retreat quietly. Instead, according to Ruth's grapevine intelligence, she began telling select neighbors a new story entirely, that I'd secretly built an illegal tower for personal profit, deceiving the entire community for years under false pretenses. The narrative war wasn't over yet. Karen's new narrative spread through private messages first, careful not to leave public traces prosecutable as defamation. He's profiting off illegal infrastructure and hiding it from all of us, messages reportedly read. Probably why he fought so hard against transparency from the very beginning. Some neighbors, exhausted, started believing it. Rosa advised documenting every rumor I could trace. Screenshotting shared messages neighbors forwarded me out of concern or curiosity. If this crosses into defamation, she said, we'll need a clear paper trail. I hated becoming a person who archived gossip, but the pattern of escalation demanded careful, unemotional preparation. Karen filed a formal lawsuit against me personally, alleging I'd violated HOA bylaws for years through undisclosed commercial use of residential property, seeking damages and injunctive relief demanding immediate removal regardless of the recall petition's progress. felt less like governance now. Purely personal, purely vindictive, purely desperate. Rosa reviewed the lawsuit and shook her head. This is weak, procedurally messy, filed in obvious retaliation timing, she said. But weak lawsuits still cost time and money to fight properly. I calculated new legal fees mentally, exhausted already by months of fines, hearings, and mounting stress affecting my entire family. Noah, sensing tension despite my efforts to shield him, asked one evening if we might lose our house. I reassured him firmly, though privately the financial strain worried me more than I let show. Fighting institutional pressure, even when factually justified, demanded resources not every family could easily sustain. Diane called with unexpected news. Signal Peak's corporate legal team, alarmed by mounting local publicity and the attempted tampering incident, offered to formally intervene as co-defendant, providing their own attorneys to help defend the tower's legal standing. You're not fighting this alone anymore, Mark, she said. Relief hit harder than expected. With Signal Peak's legal backing secured, Rosa's confidence noticeably strengthened. Corporate counsel changes everything, she said. Karen's lawsuit just went from picking on one exhausted homeowner to challenging a licensed telecom company's federally protected infrastructure rights. That's an entirely different, much harder fight for her to win. Karen, apparently undeterred, escalated once more, filing a formal complaint with my employer, falsely alleging I'd used company resources to orchestrate a smear campaign against her using confidential telecom data. My manager called me, confused, asking for clarification about accusations that made absolutely no coherent sense professionally. I explained everything calmly to my manager, providing documentation showing the complaint's baseless nature. He apologized for even needing to ask, acknowledging it seemed clearly retaliatory. Still, the experience left me shaken. Karen was reaching beyond the neighborhood now, actively trying to damage my professional reputation directly. Rosa flagged this pattern as potentially actionable harassment, separate entirely from the original silo dispute. This isn't just a stubborn HOA president anymore, she said carefully. This looks like someone unraveling under pressure, making increasingly reckless decisions without considering consequences clearly. Her assessment matched my own growing concern. Ruth mentioned overhearing Karen at the grocery store, visibly agitated, telling another neighbor she wouldn't let some tech nerd destroy everything she'd built. The phrase struck me oddly. Everything she'd built suggested stakes beyond simple neighborhood aesthetics, something more personal, more financially significant than architectural pride alone. Frank's expanding financial audit uncovered another layer. Karen herself carried substantial personal debt, reportedly tied to a failed small business venture years earlier. The consulting fees paid to Tyler's shell company, it appeared, weren't purely nepotism. Some funds seemed to route back toward Karen's own personal financial obligations. The revelation reframed everything. Karen's relentless silo campaign wasn't simply about control or aesthetics. It was financially desperate, disguised behind confident newsletters and community pride rhetoric. Understanding her likely motivation didn't excuse her actions, but it explained the increasingly reckless escalation as professional and financial pressures compounded together. Karen's lawsuit hearing date arrived faster than expected, expedited due to the injunctive relief request. Rosa and Signal Peak's corporate attorney, a sharp litigator named Patricia Nwosu, prepared thoroughly, presenting the storm connectivity data, the licensing documentation, and testimony regarding the medical alert incident as central defense evidence. In court, Karen appeared alone, having lost HOA board support entirely following the recall petition's near certain success. Her attorney requested a continuance, citing insufficient preparation time. The judge, reviewing preliminary filings, seemed visibly skeptical of the lawsuit's procedural foundation from the very first few questions asked. Patricia argued clearly, federal telecommunications law protected licensed infrastructure from arbitrary local removal demands, especially when demonstrable public safety interests existed. The judge asked pointed questions about the improperly documented HOA amendment, the confidentiality clause complicating my earlier defense, and the Storm Night emergency response data specifically. Karen's attorney struggled visibly to counter the storm data, ultimately falling back on aesthetic bylaw violations as the lawsuit's core argument. The judge noted dryly that aesthetic preferences rarely override federally protected telecommunications infrastructure, especially absent any legitimate structural safety assessment ever actually conducted on the property. The judge granted a preliminary injunction protecting the silo from removal pending full trial, effectively gutting Karen's demolition demands indefinitely. Karen's face, according to Ruth, who'd attended as a supportive spectator, showed genuine shock, as though she'd never seriously considered losing this particular battle at all. Outside the courthouse, reporters who'd been following the recall story approached Karen for comment. She declined, walking briskly toward her car, cameras capturing her visibly frustrated expression.
The footage aired that evening alongside a follow-up story.
That same week, the formal recall vote proceeded as scheduled. Turnout exceeded any previous HOA election in the community's 12-year history. Residents lined up outside the community center, some clutching printed copies of Ellie's timeline spreadsheet, now circulating informally among neighbors as an easy reference guide. The results came back decisively. 83% voted to recall Karen Whitlock from the HOA presidency, effective immediately. Bill Ostrander, stepping in as interim president, announced the results calmly, thanking residents for their engagement while acknowledging the difficult months the community had endured together throughout this ordeal. Karen didn't attend the results announcement. According to neighbors, she'd already begun quietly listing her house for sale online days earlier, apparently anticipating the outcome before it officially arrived. The confident, controlling president who'd once measured mailbox heights was preparing to leave before facing the community publicly again. I felt an unexpected pang of something complicated watching her situation unravel. Not quite sympathy, but an uncomfortable awareness that unchecked power, financial desperation, and stubborn pride had combined to destroy someone standing entirely, built slowly over years, dismantled within a few short, relentless months. Frank's expanded audit findings were formally submitted to county authorities, triggering a separate investigation into potential misappropriation of HOA reserve funds. Karen retained a criminal defense attorney, according to public court records, though no charges had yet been formally filed pending the investigation's ongoing conclusion. Tyler, facing mounting scrutiny at HarborLink over the failed tower proposal and his mother's unraveling scandal, reportedly resigned from his sales position voluntarily before the company could address the situation internally. Diane mentioned hearing secondhand that HarborLink was quietly distancing itself from the entire Ridgeview Meadows affair. One evening, unexpectedly, Karen showed up at my door again, alone, without the composed confidence she'd carried throughout our previous encounters. "I just wanted to say," she started, voice unsteady, "I never meant for it to go this far. It just kept escalating, and I didn't know how to stop." I listened without interrupting, unsure exactly what I was supposed to feel. She mentioned briefly, almost involuntarily, that her elderly mother lived nearby, dependent on a medical monitoring device requiring stable connectivity, the same kind of device Janice's mother relied on during the storm that changed everything. The irony landed heavily between us, unspoken but obvious. Karen's own mother's safety depended on exactly the kind of infrastructure Karen had spent months trying desperately to destroy, apparently without ever fully connecting those dots herself. Blinded by financial pressure, professional pride, and escalating, self-reinforcing panic. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she said quietly, looking older suddenly than I'd ever noticed before. "I just needed you to know it wasn't really about the silo. It was about feeling like I was losing control of everything else in my life. And this was the one thing I could fight." I nodded, acknowledging her honesty without excusing the damage caused. "I understand feeling out of control," I said carefully. "But you chose to take it out on people who trusted you to lead fairly. That's the part that can't just be explained away." Karen. She didn't argue, just nodded slowly. She left quietly that evening, and within 2 weeks, moved out of Ridgeview Meadows entirely, according to Ruth's ever-reliable grapevine updates. The house sold quickly, new owners unaware of the storm their predecessor had once caused across an entire neighborhood's quiet, ordinary streets. Life continued, slowly returning toward normal. The county investigation into HOA fund misappropriation concluded months later, resulting in a formal restitution order requiring Karen to repay a significant portion of the misdirected consulting fees back into HOA reserves. No criminal charges were filed, given cooperative restitution, though her reputation locally remained permanently, thoroughly damaged. Bill Ostrander, now permanently elected HOA president following a proper, transparent election, implemented new financial oversight policies requiring board-wide disclosure for any vendor relationship involving family members. Frank Cassidy stayed on as treasurer, praised widely for his diligence throughout the entire, exhausting ordeal our neighborhood had endured. Signal Peak formally recognized my property silo with an updated, properly documented lease agreement, this time filed transparently with county records, removing the confidentiality clause that had complicated my earlier defense so significantly. Diane joked I'd essentially become their favorite reluctant local celebrity landlord throughout the whole ordeal. Ellie's spreadsheet, somewhat famously now within the neighborhood, earned her a genuine college recommendation letter from Rosa, praising her analytical thinking and civic courage under pressure. She later mentioned considering law school, half-jokingly crediting Karen's silo drama as unexpected career inspiration during an otherwise ordinary summer. Janice's mother, along with several other elderly residents dependent on medical monitoring devices, formally thanked me at a community gathering organized by Bill's new administration, celebrating transparency, accountability, and the quiet, unglamorous infrastructure most people never think about until a storm reveals exactly how much it truly matters. Weeks passed as the full trial date approached, financial strain mounting despite Signal Peak's legal support covering technical infrastructure arguments. Rosa's hourly fees for the broader defamation and harassment claims still fell partly on me. forcing careful budgeting adjustments I discussed openly with Ellie and Noah at dinner. Frank's expanded audit, now formally shared with county investigators, revealed the consulting fee pattern stretched back nearly 5 years, far earlier than the silo dispute itself, suggesting Karen's financial arrangement predated her fixation on my property entirely, though the silo campaign had clearly accelerated her desperation considerably. Other residents began coming forward with their own stories once the recall vote passed and speaking up finally felt safe. A young couple described being fined repeatedly over a wheelchair ramp installed for their disabled father, dismissed by Karen as non-conforming modification, despite clear legal accessibility protections. An elderly veteran described losing a small legal battle years earlier over a modest flagpole exceeding HOA height restrictions, paying nearly $3,000 in fines and legal fees before finally complying out of sheer exhaustion. His story, shared publicly now, painted a pattern stretching back far longer than anyone realized. Bill Ostrander's new administration launched a formal review of every enforcement action taken during Karen's tenure, promising refunds where procedural violations were identified. The scope grew larger each week, revealing dozens of residents quietly harmed by selectively enforced, inconsistently documented rules over several accumulated years of leadership. Rosa suggested these additional testimonies, while not directly part of my case, could still strengthen our defamation counterclaim by establishing a documented pattern of retaliatory, disproportionate enforcement against residents who questioned her authority. Patricia agreed, incorporating select testimonies as supporting context for the upcoming trial proceedings. Meanwhile, my attorney fees continued accumulating despite Signal Peak's partial coverage. I picked up additional freelance network consulting work evenings and weekends, determined not to let Karen's lawsuit, however weak procedurally, quietly bankrupt my family through sheer prolonged legal exhaustion and mounting incidental costs. Sarah's absence, gone 3 years now since the accident, felt sharper during these stressful months. Moments I instinctively wanted to discuss everything with her fading into quiet, familiar grief. Ellie noticed sometimes, squeezing my hand wordlessly during particularly hard evenings, more perceptive about my exhaustion than I usually admitted. Diane called with encouraging news. Signal Peak's corporate communications team wanted to feature the Storm Night medical alert story in an industry publication highlighting infrastructure resilience, offering modest compensation for our cooperation. I agreed cautiously, hoping added visibility might further discourage Karen's attorney from pursuing an increasingly weak case. The article, published 3 weeks before trial, gained unexpected traction online, shared widely across telecom industry circles and local news aggregators alike. Comments largely supported the silo's importance, though a few skeptical voices questioned whether disguised infrastructure violated homeowner transparency expectations, a fair criticism I genuinely considered. Patricia used the growing public attention strategically, requesting expedited scheduling given the case's demonstrable public interest regarding emergency communications infrastructure. The judge granted a modest scheduling adjustment, moving the full trial 3 weeks earlier than originally planned, tightening our preparation timeline considerably but welcomed nonetheless. Rosa and Patricia spent long evenings preparing testimony structure, anticipating Karen's likely defense strategies given her attorney's previous courtroom performance during the preliminary injunction hearing. They expected renewed focus on aesthetic bylaw technicalities, sidestepping the financial misconduct allegations entirely as legally separate matters unrelated to demolition rights. I practiced testimony delivery repeatedly with Rosa, learning to answer concisely without emotional embellishment, letting documented facts carry persuasive weight naturally. Judges respect composure, she reminded me often. Karen's team will look for any excuse to paint you as vindictive or unstable. Don't give them that opening. Ellie asked to testify as well. Given her research directly established the coordinated timeline between Karen's complaints and Harbor Link's business interests. Rosa agreed cautiously, preparing her carefully, ensuring her testimony remained factual and measured rather than emotionally charged. Despite completely understandable teenage frustration simmering beneath her composed exterior. 2 weeks before trial, an anonymous package arrived at my house containing printed internal HarborLink emails, seemingly leaked by a disgruntled former employee, directly referencing leveraging Whitlock family HOA position to accelerate Ridgeview coverage gap narrative. I forwarded copies immediately to Rosa and Patricia, hands trembling slightly. Patricia verified the email's authenticity through subpoena requests, confirming their legitimacy against HarborLink's internal servers. The evidence, if admitted properly at trial, would directly establish coordinated intent between Karen's HOA campaign and her son's employer's business strategy, transforming circumstantial pattern evidence into explicit documented conspiracy. Karen's attorney, upon learning about the leaked emails through discovery disclosure requirements, requested another continuance, citing insufficient time to prepare adequate defense against newly introduced evidence. The judge, visibly growing impatient with repeated delays, granted only a brief 1-week extension rather than the requested month. Rosa warned me Karen might attempt settlement negotiations now, desperate to avoid a full public trial airing every damaging detail before a packed courtroom and inevitable local media coverage. Don't assume settlement means admission of guilt, though, she cautioned. Sometimes people settle purely to control damage, not out of genuine remorse. Sure enough, Karen's attorney reached out proposing settlement, dropping her lawsuit entirely in exchange for my agreement not to pursue defamation or harassment counterclaims. Rosa recommended rejecting it outright. You have overwhelming evidence now, she said. Settling lets her avoid full accountability. Sometimes justice matters more than convenience. I discussed the decision carefully with Ellie and Noah, wanting them to understand why pursuing full accountability mattered beyond simply resolving our personal situation quickly. Sometimes doing what's right takes longer and costs more, I told them.
But it protects other people.
Noah, now 13, surprised me with his response. I think we should finish it, Dad, he said firmly. Karen hurt a lot of people, not just us. If we stop now, maybe she does it again somewhere else. His clarity, 13, reminded me exactly why this fight still mattered. We formally rejected the settlement offer through Rosa, informing Karen's attorney the trial would proceed as scheduled. According to courthouse gossip Ruth relayed later, Karen reportedly grew visibly distressed upon hearing the rejection, understanding now that every damaging detail would indeed become fully public record shortly. The week before trial, local news ran a preview segment, Silo standoff heads to court, small-town HOA scandal draws statewide attention. Reporters requested interviews. I declined most, preferring Rosa's measured public statements instead, wanting the courtroom facts to speak clearly rather than pretrial media spectacle overshadowing everything. Diane offered one final piece of supporting evidence. Updated coverage maps showing exactly how many households, medical devices, and emergency service connections depended specifically on my silo's continued operation. The visual, stark and undeniable, would likely resonate powerfully with any judge weighing competing claims about aesthetic preference versus genuine safety. The night before trial, couldn't sleep, running through testimony details repeatedly in my mind. Ellie found me at the kitchen table around midnight, unable to sleep either. We sat together quietly, not needing much conversation, just steady, comfortable presence before facing whatever tomorrow's courtroom held for us. Ruth called early that morning, wishing luck, promising she'd attend as a character witness if needed regarding Karen's broader pattern of selective enforcement across the neighborhood. Frank confirmed he'd testify too, regarding the financial audit findings, providing crucial institutional credibility beyond my own personal, potentially biased perspective. Rosa met me outside the courthouse, calm and focused despite months of accumulated pressure building toward this single decisive day. "Whatever happens in there," she said, "you did everything right. Documented everything. Stayed measured. Regardless of outcome." Her reassurance steadied something nervous still fluttering beneath my composure. The courtroom filled quickly, far beyond typical HOA dispute attendance, reflecting the case's unusual public interest given telecom infrastructure implications and the widely circulated financial misconduct allegations. Karen entered separately, flanked by her attorney, visibly tense, avoiding eye contact with the gathering crowd of familiar neighborhood faces. The judge called the courtroom to order, reviewing preliminary case summaries aloud before inviting opening statements. Patricia rose first, confident and measured, beginning methodically, "Your Honor, this case ultimately concerns whether personal grievance can override federally protected infrastructure critical to public safety across an entire residential community." Karen's attorney countered in his opening statement, framing the case narrowly around unauthorized commercial property use violating residential zoning expectations, deliberately avoiding any mention of the leaked HarborLink emails or financial misconduct allegations still pending in the parallel county investigation running alongside this civil trial. Patricia called Diane first, establishing the silo's licensed telecommunications status through detailed technical documentation, coverage maps, and historical maintenance records spanning several years. Karen's attorney objected repeatedly to relevance, mostly overruled, as the judge seemed genuinely interested in understanding the infrastructure's actual community importance. Under cross-examination, Karen's attorney pressed Diane about the confidentiality clause, suggesting it proved deliberate concealment from residents. Diane calmly explained industry-standard security protocols protecting camouflaged infrastructure from vandalism or tampering, noting ironically that recent attempted tampering at this exact property validated precisely those original security concerns. Patricia then called Janice, whose emotional but measured testimony described her mother's medical emergency during the storm, the alert pendant's successful connection, and paramedics arriving within minutes despite widespread regional outages elsewhere. Several jurors, present for advisory input despite this being a bench trial, visibly reacted. Karen's attorney's cross-examination of Janice felt uncomfortably aggressive, questioning whether she could definitively prove the silo specifically enabled her mother's emergency call versus general area coverage. Janice, unwavering, cited Diane's technical testimony directly, refusing to let doubt be manufactured around genuinely documented, verified facts. Frank testified next, walking the judge through his financial audit findings methodically, the Whitlock Advisory Group payments, the pattern spanning years, the improperly disclosed related party transactions violating clear state HOA governance statutes. His treasurer credentials lent significant institutional weight to otherwise potentially dismissible circumstantial financial patterns. Karen's attorney argued the financial misconduct allegations remained legally separate from the property dispute itself, requesting the judge disregard Frank's testimony as irrelevant prejudicial character evidence. The judge disagreed, noting motive evidence remained relevant when establishing whether enforcement actions constituted good faith governance versus retaliatory personal agenda. Ellie testified next, visibly nervous but composed, walking the courtroom through her timeline spreadsheet methodically. She explained her research process clearly, emphasizing she'd simply organized publicly available dates rather than drawing unfounded conclusions, letting the documented sequence speak plainly for itself without unnecessary embellishment or speculation. Karen's attorney attempted a gentler cross-examination approach with Ellie, given her age, asking whether her father had directed her research. Ellie firmly clarified she'd conducted the analysis independently, motivated by frustration over online harassment targeting our family, not adult coaching or predetermined conclusions imposed upon her research. Patricia then introduced the leaked HarborLink emails formally into evidence. Reading select excerpts aloud that explicitly referenced leveraging Whitlock family HOA position. Karen's attorney objected vigorously regarding authentication concerns, but the judge, having reviewed subpoenaed server records beforehand, allowed the evidence's admission over strenuous continued objection. The email excerpt landed heavily across the courtroom. Internal HarborLink correspondence discussing timeline coordination between Karen's public silo campaign and their
competing tower proposal submission, explicitly naming Tyler as the internal liaison, managing his mother's community influence toward achieving their desired business outcome.
Karen's composure, largely maintained throughout earlier testimony, finally cracked visibly upon hearing the email read aloud publicly. She whispered urgently to her attorney, gesturing sharply, clearly unhappy about evidence she'd perhaps hoped would never surface this explicitly within a formal courtroom setting. During recess, Ruth mentioned overhearing Karen's attorney privately advising her to consider testifying herself, given how damaging the accumulated evidence had become. Karen reportedly resisted initially, though ultimately agreed, perhaps recognizing her credibility now required direct, personal defense rather than relying solely on procedural legal objections. When court resumed, Karen took the stand herself, visibly tense but attempting composed dignity. Her attorney guided gentle initial questions establishing her community involvement history, painting a picture of genuine civic dedication rather than personal financial motivation behind her relentless enforcement actions throughout recent years. Under Patricia's cross-examination, Karen's composure deteriorated steadily. Asked directly whether she disclosed her son's HarborLink employment to fellow board members before authorizing consulting payments, she hesitated visibly before admitting, quietly, "No. I didn't think it was necessary at the time." The courtroom fell noticeably silent. Patricia pressed further, asking whether Karen had personally benefited financially from the consulting arrangement given her own documented outstanding debts. Karen's attorney objected strenuously. The judge allowed the question, given its direct relevance to establishing potential personal financial motivation underlying her aggressive silo removal campaign. Karen answered carefully, admitting partial financial assistance from Tyler during a difficult period, though insisting it remained family support, not payback for anything specific. Her explanation, technically plausible, sounded increasingly hollow against the accumulated weight of coordinated timing evidence already established throughout the proceedings' earlier testimony. Patricia's final question landed sharply. Ms. Whitlock, did you ever conduct or commission an actual structural safety assessment before repeatedly claiming this silo posed collapse risk to neighboring homes? Karen paused for an uncomfortably long moment before admitting, quietly, no. I didn't think it was necessary. That admission effectively demolished her lawsuit's core original justification entirely. The safety claims that had launched this entire ordeal months earlier turned out to be,
by her own sworn testimony, unsubstantiated assumptions never actually verified through any legitimate professional inspection or engineering assessment whatsoever.
Karen's attorney attempted brief redirect, trying to salvage some remaining credibility around aesthetic bylaw violations independent of safety claims. But the damage from her own admissions had already fundamentally undermined the case's broader credibility. Regardless of whatever narrower technical arguments remained theoretically still available for consideration. Closing arguments followed swiftly. Patricia summarized methodically, licensed federal infrastructure, demonstrated public safety value, improperly documented bylaw amendments, undisclosed financial conflicts of interest, and coordinated business timing evidence, all pointing toward retaliatory personal agenda rather than legitimate, good faith community governance throughout this entire extended dispute. Karen's attorney's closing felt noticeably weaker, falling back primarily on narrow procedural technicalities about original permitting documentation for the silo's telecommunications conversion decades earlier, essentially conceding the broader financial and safety arguments had become indefensible given everything established throughout the day's extensive testimony. The judge announced she'd take the matter under advisement, promising a written ruling within 2 weeks given the case's complexity and significant public interest. Implications regarding both telecommunications infrastructure protection and HOA governance accountability more broadly across similar community associations statewide. Walking out of the courthouse, reporters gathered immediately, requesting comment. Rosa handled most questions professionally, emphasizing we looked forward to a fair, evidence-based ruling. I stayed mostly quiet, exhausted after an emotionally grueling day, grateful simply that the full truth had finally been presented completely, transparently, publicly. Ellie hugged me tightly outside the courthouse steps, relief visible after her nervous testimony earlier that morning. I was so scared, she admitted, but it felt good telling the truth out loud, in front of everyone, instead of just online arguments nobody could really settle properly. I agreed completely. That evening, local news aired extensive courtroom coverage, focusing heavily on Karen's admission regarding the never-conducted safety assessment. Social media reaction, previously divided, shifted overwhelmingly critical of her conduct throughout the entire saga. Comments filled with genuine anger toward the manufactured, ultimately baseless safety justification. 2 weeks later, exactly as promised, the judge issued her written ruling, permanent injunction protecting the silo from demolition, dismissal of Karen's original lawsuit entirely, and a finding that her enforcement actions constituted bad faith retaliatory governance warranting separate consideration for defamation and harassment damages moving forward. The ruling further recommended the county's parallel financial misconduct investigation proceed toward formal resolution, citing sufficient documented evidence supporting potential restitution requirements beyond what the civil trial itself could directly address within its narrower jurisdictional scope regarding the property dispute specifically. Rosa called me personally with the news before I'd even finished reading the full ruling myself. You won, Mark, she said simply. Completely, thoroughly, on every point that mattered. I sat quietly for a long moment afterward, feeling something complicated settle finally into place after months of relentless, exhausting pressure. News of the ruling spread quickly through Ridgeview Meadows, neighbors stopping by unprompted to offer congratulations and quiet apologies for ever doubting me during Karen's earlier, confidently persuasive campaign against the silo. Ruth brought lemon bars again, joking they'd become our unofficial celebration tradition throughout this ordeal. Diane called with Signal Peak's official response, a formal thank you letter, expanded lease terms recognizing the property's proven community value, and an invitation to speak briefly at an upcoming regional telecom infrastructure conference about disguised tower resilience during emergency situations. I accepted, cautiously proud of the unexpected outcome. The county's financial misconduct investigation concluded shortly after, formally confirming Karen's undisclosed related party payments violated state HOA governance statutes. She agreed to a restitution settlement, repaying a substantial portion of misdirected funds back into HOA reserves over an extended payment schedule, avoiding formal criminal prosecution through full cooperation. Karen's defamation and harassment liability, addressed separately per the judge's ruling, resulted in a modest but symbolically significant damages award covering my accumulated legal fees and documented professional harm from her false complaint filed with my employer. Rosa considered it a meaningful, if incomplete, form of accountability. Tyler, already having resigned from HarborLink amid the scandal's fallout, reportedly relocated out of state entirely, distancing himself from both his mother's unraveling situation and the professional damage his own involvement had caused within the competitive telecommunications industry he'd previously hoped to build a lasting career within. HarborLink Telecom issued a brief public statement distancing the company from Tyler's individual conduct, emphasizing their formal proposal withdrawal months earlier and denying any corporate strategy involving coordinated HOA manipulation, despite the leaked internal emails suggesting otherwise to anyone who'd followed the trial's extensive public coverage. Bill Ostrander's administration finalized new HOA governance reforms, including mandatory financial disclosure requirements, independent annual audits, and a formal grievance process protected from board president scheduling control. Frank Cassidy, widely credited for his diligent audit work, was elected treasurer permanently by an overwhelming resident vote. The community held an informal gathering that autumn, partly celebrating the resolved dispute, partly simply reconnecting after months of tension that had strained friendships and neighborly trust throughout Ridgeview Meadows. Janice's mother attended, healthy and smiling, personally thanking me again for infrastructure she'd never previously understood mattered. Karen didn't attend, having sold her house and relocated to a neighboring county months earlier, according to Ruth's reliably thorough grapevine updates. Nobody seemed to miss her presence particularly, though a few neighbors mentioned occasionally wondering how she was adjusting to life after such a dramatic, thoroughly public downfall. I received an unexpected letter from her several months later, forwarded through Rosa's office, apologizing more fully than her brief doorstep visit had allowed previously. She mentioned starting therapy, addressing what she called control issues, stemming from financial anxiety she'd hidden from everyone, including herself, for years. I didn't respond immediately, uncertain what an appropriate reply might even look like given everything our families had endured throughout this extended, exhausting conflict. Eventually, I wrote back briefly, acknowledging her apology without excusing the damage caused, wishing her genuine improvement without inviting continued personal contact going forward. Ellie's college application essay, drafted that winter, focused entirely on the silo dispute, emphasizing critical thinking, civic courage, and the importance of questioning authority through evidence rather than emotion. Rose's earlier recommendation letter complemented it perfectly, and Ellie received several encouraging early acceptance responses within months. Noah, meanwhile, developed an unexpected interest in telecommunications engineering after watching Diane explain coverage mapping technology throughout the ordeal, asking increasingly detailed questions about network infrastructure during casual dinner conversations that would have seemed impossibly specific just 1 year earlier. Before any of this began, the silo itself remained standing, weathered steel catching afternoon sunlight exactly as it had throughout my entire childhood, quietly continuing its essential, unglamorous work connecting an entire neighborhood's calls, alerts, and emergencies without most residents ever fully appreciating its significance beyond occasional passing curiosity or aesthetic indifference. Diane's regional conference presentation went well, generating modest industry interest in disguised infrastructure resilience strategies for similar rural suburban transition communities facing comparable coverage challenges nationwide. I declined further public speaking invitations afterward, preferring quiet normalcy over continued visibility surrounding an ordeal I mostly wanted behind us. Bill's reformed HOA board, a year later, formally recognized the silo with a small bronze plaque near the property line, reading simply, "Community Infrastructure, protected by Ridgeview Meadows residents." Felt understated, appropriate, nothing flashy or celebratory, just quiet acknowledgement of something genuinely important finally properly understood. Ruth passed away peacefully that following spring, and at her memorial service, several neighbors mentioned her steady, quiet support throughout the entire silo dispute, how her early willingness to publicly disagree with Karen had encouraged others toward similar courage. I missed her lemon bars more than I expected to. Frank remained treasurer for years afterward, occasionally joking during HOA meetings about keeping receipts for everything, a light-hearted reference everyone understood immediately given the community's shared, hard-won institutional memory regarding financial transparency's genuine importance following Karen's extended, costly period of unchecked, unquestioned leadership. Looking back, I recognized the entire ordeal had taught my children something textbooks rarely manage successfully. That quiet documentation, patient persistence, and factual honesty could eventually overcome confident, aggressive dishonesty, even when institutional power initially favored the louder, more forceful voice throughout the conflict's earlier, more uncertain stages. 2 years after the trial concluded, Ridgeview Meadows operates under transparent, accountable leadership, with Bill's governance reforms still firmly in place protecting residents from the kind of unchecked authority Karen once wielded so confidently throughout her lengthy, largely unquestioned presidency across our previously trusting community. Ellie, now studying pre-law at college, still occasionally references the silo case during class discussions about civic accountability and evidence-based advocacy. Proud of the small but meaningful role her teenage research played in exposing a pattern of governance abuse extending far beyond our own family's original dispute. Signal Peak's expanded, properly documented lease continues generating modest supplemental income, helping offset ongoing property taxes while providing reliable coverage the entire neighborhood now openly appreciates, especially during severe weather events when neighboring subdivisions occasionally still experience the kind of outages we no longer worry about. Karen, according to occasional second-hand updates through mutual acquaintances, rebuilt a quieter life in her new county, reportedly working in an unrelated field entirely, apparently having stepped away permanently from community leadership roles following the very public, thoroughly documented collapse of her once confident local reputation. I still walk past the silo most mornings, coffee in hand, remembering my grandfather's patient hands repairing its roof decades ago, grateful the old structure survived not just weather and rust, but an entirely different kind of storm nobody in our family had ever anticipated facing together. The silo still stands today, unremarkable to strangers driving past, quietly essential to everyone who actually lives here, a rusted reminder that appearances rarely tell the whole story, and that genuine value often hides exactly where the loudest critics least expect to find it. Karen taught me, ultimately, that unchecked authority thrives on assumption and silence, and that patient documentation, calm persistence, and honest evidence remain powerful tools against even the most confident, aggressive overreach, lessons I hope my children carry forward long after this particular ordeal fades into memory. Ridgeview Meadows moved forward, stronger and more transparent than before, proving that communities can heal from division when truth finally gets its fair, patient hearing. The silo remains standing, connected, essential, and completely, permanently safe from ever being torn down again. The END.